Thank you for joining us in Community Planning Conversations. Today, Jan Metzger is joining me. She is in town from Chicago doing some work for the Mass Transit District. Jan, welcome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Good to be here.
Why are you in town exactly?
Well, I'm in town today as part of a larger project that will bring me back several times, but today specifically there was a summit of several different consultant groups working for the Mass Transit District, the City of Champaign, for the university, and there were people from Big Small All also to make sure that all of our work on behalf of the people in Champaign, Urbana, and Savoy is coordinated.
And what are these people thinking about in relationship to transportation, and why do there have to be so many entities? Why couldn't there be just one group that would look at the total picture of the issue of transportation?
Well, transportation is very interlocked with virtually everything else we do, really. And that's one part of the question that you can't really separate out transportation from land use. You can't separate it out from economic development. But the other answer is that different people have different geographies. So the university has a very small geography that it's concerned about, and they're looking at ways to improve movement within that small geography. Big Small All, on the other hand, looks at the whole county of Champaign, and so they have policies not only on transportation and housing, but on things like agricultural issues, which don't really affect entities like the university or even the closer in communities of Champaign and Urbana. So you can't make transportation decisions in a vacuum. You really have to make them in a context, and the context may be different depending on people's statutory responsibilities. So the Mass Transit District has a geography that's slightly different than, say, either of the municipalities. It covers parts of 3 municipalities.
And so then how does this fit in with CUATS? CUATS is
Well,
supposed to serve the whole
right.
county.
And they do, and CUATS is participating in all of these processes. And in fact, there was a person from CUATS at the meeting this morning talking about a corridor study that's going on right now. And they're focused on that one corridor and how the planning for that interrelates to the other planning processes that are going on. But they do have the overall responsibility for implementing some of these long-term plans. Or they have the responsibility not so much for implementing, but for scoping out what needs to be done, and then other entities will do some of the implementation.
And just as an aside, what is the corridor that CUATS is focusing on?
Does everybody know what CUATS is? The Champaign Urbana, you help me out, your Champaign Urbana Regional Transportation Study?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Yes. But I'm sorry. So what is the corridor that they're
Right.
working on?
What is the corridor?
Staley Rising corridor. So it's only a small slice that they're currently doing a study on, although their long-term 2025 long-range transportation plan is a guide for everybody for the larger area.
Okay. And before we get into more depth on the reason you're involved with the mass transit, how did you get involved with transportation planning?
I came to the Center for Neighborhood Technology basically as a community activist in order to do more of what the center does very well in terms of bringing lay people into processes, bringing everyday citizens in, and sometimes not citizens also, into processes that they are normally excluded from. So I have a long history of working with institutions in my community, with schools, with parks. And when I took this job doing transportation advocacy work originally, it was around breaking down barriers between people in communities and people who are professionals in the transportation planning world. In some words, in some ways being an interpreter between them because they're not always talking the same language. even when both sides have the best intentions. And so my role has been to try to get over those,
Find a common vocabulary.
right, bridge those communications gaps.
Okay, and you mentioned the Neighborhood Technology Center. Folks in our part of the state probably aren't very acquainted with it. Why don't you talk about that?
CNT, which we use the acronym CNT because Center for Neighborhood Technology is a pretty big mouthful. Has really two focal groups that people don't intuitively think of as going together, and they're economic development and environmental sustainability. And the idea behind a good deal of what we do is that we don't have to damage something in order to create jobs. There are ways to create jobs, or create, in my case with the transportation, access to jobs without creating the huge air quality, water quality, and quality of life problems that some of our recent transportation planning has evolved towards.
And you've been there how long?
I've been there 12 years.
And are you a Chicago native?
I didn't grow up in Chicago, but I actually grew up out of state and considered myself a displaced Chicagoan the whole time. So,
And where did you go to school?
I went to school at Wayne State University in Detroit.
Okay, so from one large city to another large city. Well, let's talk about why you are here and what you are doing with the Champaign-Urbana Mass Transit District, or CUMTD as we sometimes
Yes.
refer to them, or just MTD, we often say.
We have created a tool at the Center for Neighborhood Technology, again, in this context of helping people bridge the gap between technical expertise and what people on the street have as expertise. And it is real expertise. They know what they need. They know what the problems are trying to get from one place to another. They may not know what ratio a curve has to be made at. That's an engineering question, but that's not the question you start with. You start with the question of, or you should start with the question of, what do people need, and how do they move around? And so we created a tool that was actually an advocacy tool at one point in time when we didn't have the ear of the Regional Transportation Agency in northeastern Illinois. And we wanted to prove that the public could make very relevant, very intelligent statements if they were just asked in the proper way. So we created a tool called Neighborhood Transopoly, or actually just Transopoly first. We had a large version, a large scale, to cover a county at a time, for instance. Since then, we've developed Neighborhood Transopoly to really bore down in a very localized way in what people would want in their communities. And we did that because when people did the first Transopoly, the countywide level, they said, I really like doing this. It really helps me understand, what the constraints are, and helps me express what I want to express, but I want to do it for my neighborhood. So that's the tool that we're talking about now, that will be applied here in Champaign-Urbana. And it basically creates a game-like atmosphere. So people, instead of having to struggle through a 300-page document, which sometimes transportation agencies might release to the public and say, here, you can comment on this, but who can, really? Instead of doing that, people play a game with their peers, their neighbors, but we have a way that we'll talk about a little bit later of making sure it's a broad variety of neighbors, and they come to some agreements, even though their interests are somewhat different, on what would make their geography more workable in terms of getting around. They do that within a constrained budget, so just like in the regular planning processes, they have to make trade-offs, and they do it with a little bit of uncertainty put into the game. So when people roll a 7, for instance, they have to draw something called a contingency card. Just like in Monopoly, you have chance cards. And if you answer the question right, your group may get a little bit more money to spend. If you answer it wrong, you could lose some money. And in reality, that happens in the real world. People think they're going to have this much for a given year in their budgets, and then something happens and they have to use the money differently, or the state didn't send as much as they expected. So that kind of constant shuffling and dealing with change and uncertainty is also built into the game.
So, what was the inspiration for the design of this game?
Um,
Taking a shower one morning
no,
and
no, no.
struck by a thunderbolt? Or?
No, I have to say there is another game that bears some resemblance to this called Strings and Ribbons, and it's in the public domain. We thought about trying to bring that to our region and applying it there, and there were some parts of it that we thought worked well in certain situations but didn't accomplish what we were trying to accomplish. For one thing, it didn't accomplish the consensus basis for decision making that we liked. People basically are seated around a table, given a certain amount of money, and each told that they could spend their money as they wish, and some of them have to make deals if they want to buy bigger ticket items. But more of the money is spent on the basis of, I wish we could have this. What we did in Neighborhood Transopoly is formalize it so that groups had to come to consensus. They had to...
Partnerships had to be built.
Right. Throughout the game, not just on a couple of big ticket items.
Well, can you take us a bit through this game and introduce us to what we'll be experiencing here in the community?
Sure. We've got some slides that will help us a little bit to understand. And these actually, I should preface this by saying these slides are all information that's shown in a brochure, which I'll hold up in a few minutes, and I hope people will kind of look for it around Champaign and Urbana and Savoy. We'll hopefully be in lots of different places soon.
So this will be contained to these 3 communities, not throughout the whole county?
It's the Mass Transit District area,
Okay.
primarily, that we'll be working in. So Transopoly, as I've just described, is just a fun way to let people articulate what they want to say, but it provides a lot of useful data because we actually tabulate everything that people say.
So they'll
and the
start with
purchases they
some
make.
base maps there. Is
They
that
have,
what I see?
They have a map that is the game board for their community, the 2x2 square area. And the next slide we'll see how the 2x2 areas break out in Champaign and Urbana. People work on this map. If you can see in the top right-hand picture, there's actually a board with some linear strips. Those are infrastructure. Those are things like bike lanes, sidewalks, different kinds of transportation infrastructure that people would buy. And they actually glue them down. You can see in the middle picture that people have glued pink lines and orange lines and blue lines. Those all represent different purchases. So we know at the end of the game how much each table spent, what they spent it on, and where they would have put it.
Okay.
And
Can they
then
change their mind?
they
since it's
can
being
change their
glued
mind.
down?
They can change their mind. Actually, we use this special glue throughout the game that makes the back of the paper like a Post-it note.
I see.
And then at the end of the game, we have them tape everything so that we don't lose a single piece of record of what they did when we transfer it back to the office. So people have to live within this budget. They have to make good decisions. What we really like about this is that it puts people from very different backgrounds together. They may share a neighborhood, but one person may be elderly. One person may be a biker. Their interests may seem to be somewhat different, but they can come to consensus on what benefits a broader
But
group of
how
people.
can you guarantee that the elderly person will come to this meeting, or that very smart junior high?
Well, we're going to talk about the
Okay.
recruiting strategy in a
All
couple
right.
of slides. So let's just move forward to the next slide. This is the slide that shows where we'll be doing this, and there are the squares that you see are representative of what will be the game board for 8 different meetings in neighborhoods that cover virtually all of the mass transit district territory. Now, there's a few outlier blocks that just don't fit in the 2x2. We encourage people to come to the closest one to them, because what you're really, we're not engineering anything. No real money is going into the ground based on this. This is not specifically. This is a way to get a vision from the community. So if you happen to be a block or two away, we encourage you to come anyways, and the Mass Transit District and all the other planning entities, here's what the desire of the community is.
But I live in the area where you have the icon of the automobile. Are we only going to talk about automobiles? Because I'm really a bicyclist, so should I go to the meeting that's in the area with the bicycle
That's
icon?
a really good question. When people do look at the map, it will be much more intuitive that those icons are just a way to link the names, like South Champaign, to link that particular square through the icon with the title.
Oh,
of the
I
thing.
see.
So, no, the icon is really just a kind of fun way to represent different different geographies, and they use transportation themes in the design because this is a transportation project. But no, we will be talking about all modes in all parts of the area, and if you can, when you look really closely, you notice that there is a helicopter one and an airplane one, and that's the clue that no, this really isn't about
Well,
helicopter
I was going
travel.
to say Willard Airport is a big issue in our community, so everybody might have gone to that meeting concerning the airplane and forgotten that the issue really is broader and of all kinds of multimodal transportation.
Right. No, this is about surface transportation, and what we really are trying to keep people thinking very broadly about whatever they want to say. Part of the beauty of this game is we've created some protocols that people can use. We've created the little strips that say, here are some choices you might want to make, but we always have a special space on the game board for unique ideas and regional innovations, because we don't want to presume that we already know all of what people will say and have created a way for them to say it. And some of the best information that we get is what comes from the regional innovations and the policy changes. That
And
people
how
want.
do you control for consistency in what is being asked so that there doesn't develop an inlaid bias because of the way things are presented to the groups?
We do a very short PowerPoint presentation that just tries to level the playing field so that people understand what's going to go on that evening, what a few of the general planning concepts are, so that you don't have one person who's working in the field who can dominate the group. But we really do try very hard not to give direction or anything about what the results should be. And we make it very clear over and over that we've created the outline of what you could potentially buy as just a starting point, and if people want to suggest other things completely different. And in fact, we've often had people say that there were enforcement issues that needed to be dealt with, or we had some very interesting recommendations that what we need is not driver education but mobility education, that we're really limiting the way our kids think of the world by what we teach them in school. So a lot of things come out that are related to transportation but aren't necessarily, we need to fix this pothole. People are looking at a much bigger picture.
Okay.
Okay? One of the things I want to be sure that everybody understands is we don't do this alone. We can't, as people who don't live in Champaign-Urbana, come in and hold a meeting and expect that people will flock to it. And in addition to wanting to make sure that we do have people there, we also feel very strongly about having a representative group of people. So what we do is work with a number of partners, and this is our list of partners. There are quite a few, and they represent a very broad variety of interests. And some of the groups are transportation groups, but we have the university and Parkland College. We have groups that do advocacy for people with disabilities. We have a grade school district. We have the senior services of Champaign County, so that we are making sure to have linkages. You asked earlier, how can we be sure we're going to have those elderly people come to the meeting? Well, we can't be sure of anything, because this isn't a focus group where we're paying people to come. Mm-hmm. However, we do give them dinner as long as they've made a reservation.
Do you want to say that again?
We do give people dinner as long as they've made a reservation, but we don't have dinners for people who haven't reserved. But we will work directly with the groups that work with these constituencies, so that hopefully we'll have the views of parents of young children at the same time that we have the views of people who are older, people who are disabled, people who drive autos, people who ride bikes, people. We looked very hard for a pedestrian advocacy group, and don't have one as regional partners. However, if there's a group out there, we'll be glad to add them as a regional partner now too. So we want to be sure to represent a lot of different interests at each of these 8 meetings. We don't want to have the bike meeting and the car meeting. We want people talking across the table from their respective interests.
Did I see the Champaign County Healthcare Consumers listed as one of the partners?
You didn't. I'm sorry.
Well, it's a very important issue in the community in relationship to the movement of Christie Clinic out beyond the 2 freeways. And they might be a very important group to
We would love to have them.
engage in this kind of conversation because of concerns of how do the people then get out to that clinic, mm-hmm. because right now it's in the center of downtown Champaign, mm-hmm. and it also has a pharmacy. Mm-hmm. So mm-hmm. there will be transportation issues connected with that decision.
This is not a fixed list. It's not a list that's exclusive. We're happy to have other people as regional partners. And in fact, we've had a couple of groups who didn't feel that they could make the formal commitment to be mm-hmm. regional partners, but want to stay in the loop, and they'll receive information so that hopefully a lot of their membership knows about and will come to these meetings too. We do ask people who are regional partners to commit to recruit a couple of people for each meeting. So there is a little bit of, it's not just having your name on a brochure.
No, I understood that.
And then you're all done.
There's effort behind this.
Yes, we really do ask a little bit, a limited amount of the regional partners.
And how are you, or how have you in the past, sort of controlled for the folks who are determined to get to every one of the meetings, so all of their ideas get placed off? And this was not a major problem, but it certainly demonstrated itself with the meetings that were held for Big Small All, where it's a contingent that went to all of the 9 meetings mm-hmm. until all of their ideas got up on the board.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying to the senior services or the Urban League or the school district that you want to get some members from your group to be at each meeting, so your interests are heard at each meeting. But I think you're asking a different question. You're saying an individual or 2 or 3 who want to be at every meeting. I think what will happen is they'll find it's not a very good venue to repeat the same thing over and over again. One of the beauties of the game is that it's so egalitarian that nobody gets to have the floor for a long period of time. And so, people who have had their say and feel very satisfied, and then people will start to see reports come out very shortly after these meetings, and to see that what they said was captured, documented, and is being disseminated and delivered specifically to the decision makers. That's more satisfying sometime. Although Big Small All, I think, was documenting things all along too, weren't they?
Oh, they were documenting
Yeah.
things all along. It wasn't being posted. Are you going to post the results of each meeting before the next meeting, or are you going to hold those postings?
Well, some of the
until
meetings are one night right after the
I
other.
saw that on the schedule.
No, I think I can say that when the November meetings roll around, we will have all or substantially all of the October meetings posted. But
Okay.
we cannot promise to post them one
Okay.
night after another.
Well, I wasn't just thinking of that, but I was thinking of poisoning the well. In other words, if people
Oh.
were reading comments one way or the other. I mean, it can go positive or negative. If they really thought these were great, you can poison the well by making sure
Right.
those come up. And if they were really against it, they could go
I
and
think
make sure
the
that.
kind of reports we do from the neighborhood Transopoly meetings themselves are very specific to that area. Table 1 said, do this at this intersection, do this with this street, add service here.
We need a
fix
shelter,
this.
bus shelter
Right,
there, and things of
right.
that nature. I see.
So it would be really hard to say that that could poison the well for, or lead, to put it in a better context, lead, feed the ideas of people in another area necessarily. What will happen after this is all over, after the first of the year, there'll be a comprehensive report that kind of then interprets what does this mean across the board. There were X number of people and X number of groups who worked together. They said these things in general about transit across the area. Or people who live in the northern part of the area had this issue. People who lived in the southern part did not have that issue. Or people who are students had, these, or where there are concentrations of students, we got more results like this. Where there are not concentrations of students, we got different results. So we'll look at the kinds of across-the-board remarks that were made after the reports are all published.
Do you come to this with a survey research background, or have you
No.
learned this
No.
as you?
There are actually simultaneous surveys going on. Our consultant team, which includes 4 different entities, has one entity working specifically on market research. So they've already conducted stakeholder interviews. They're doing surveys on buses. In October, they're doing some surveys, email surveys to several
So
different
if I'm a
groups.
bus rider, I might be
You
surveyed
might be.
sometime
You
during
might be.
October. And why don't you define stakeholder?
The stakeholder interviews were conducted with entities that have economic development interests, businesses.
So
who have
maybe people who were
employees
out
who-
in the research park area. You might have talked
Right.
to folks
Well,
out there.
I did not do this myself. This is another part of our consultant team, but I don't want to pretend to be an expert on their work. I know of it. I don't do it myself. So they also talked to some of the groups that are regional partners, so that they were making sure to hear the voices in these interviews of the disability community and of minority communities, so that it's a much more formal but individual conversation with people about what they see as the issues. So really what the Mass Transit District has done is set in motion a whole variety of ways of getting public input, from the email surveys and the written surveys on the buses to the interviews to these public meetings, and then a lot of information back to people. One of the things I would like to do in a couple minutes is put up some contact information. But in the meantime,
Okay.
I just want to mention that we do have a brochure that's just coming from the printer today. This is actually not even one of the official copies yet, but I wanted to have a visual. And I hope people will start to see this all across the region, because this has all the information that's been shown on the screen and more, much more information about what we're doing and how we're doing it and how people can participate in it. And then the last slide that I wanted to show has contact information, and I don't know how long we can leave it up now, but perhaps we can put it back up at the end
And just to remind people, that contact information is in the brochure.
It's all in the brochure, and we have many different ways for people to find out about this, including people who are hearing impaired can call a TTY number. People who want to ask questions in Spanish have a number that they can call where somebody from the Regional Planning Commission who is bilingual will answer their questions. So we've tried to make sure that people can get information in as many ways as possible. Web access, print, telephone. We really want everybody to know all about this.
Is there a central website, a simple URL that we can give people to think about?
There is, and we can back up for just a minute.
Okay.
And it's at the bottom of this page. It's on the brochure also. I have my plan, MI plan, and let me talk about that for a minute.
Do.
It's not just an odd spelling to help you remember. It's actually some of that transportation terminology turned into a kind of personalized approach to this. My plan is a mobility implementation plan. So we're not asking people to come and tell us just what do you want to do about bus service. We're really asking people, how do you want to get around? How do you want to be mobile? So a mobility implementation plan, my plan, became a kind of a flashy a play on words to help people remember this idea of my plan. And it's about our communities, or people, the communities of people here. It's a personalized approach.
And people may also have heard the term multimodal as a way of talking about this. So it's walking and biking and bus and cars and motor scooters and skateboards
and in fact, maybe things
running.
We haven't thought about yet.
That's true.
Maybe there are some new things that people want to talk about that aren't even in the mix right now. Maybe there are, a few years ago the Segway was the next big thing. It didn't really seem to take off that much.
It hasn't caught on yet.
Who knows what, 5 years from now or 10 years from now.
And
people will be thinking
Segway
about.
is the motorized
It's kind of like a standing scooter.
Scooter that people thought would work well in big warehouses or on sidewalks.
Yeah.
To get people
Yeah.
around very quickly. While we're talking about these meetings, didn't I see a schedule here in your brochure?
Mm-hmm.
And they start on the 10th of October,
They do.
correct?
They do.
And the last meeting is the 30th of November.
That's right. We've got 5 in October and 3 in November.
And those 3 in November right after Thanksgiving.
That's
so
right.
So that will gather all of the information, and then it'll be up on this website that
It will be the individual reports from the October meetings will start to go up within I hope a week or two after the meeting is held.
Okay, so now you have all this information
Mm-hmm.
gathered from Playing Transopoly and these stakeholder interviews and the bus surveys. What's next?
There are other parts of this
Puzzle.
long. Well, it's a multi-year process. It's not just sort of come into Champaign-Urbana for a couple months and then fade away. There are several other pieces to this. One other piece that the Center for Neighborhood Technology is involved in is applying a different tool that we have called an H+T affordability index. So this is a mappable model. We can actually create maps showing the cost to households in communities of living in different places based on not only the housing cost but the transportation cost. So information like that will be brought to bear also on the planning process here. What is the cost of doing this kind of transportation plan versus this kind of transportation plan? If we grow more compactly, will households have more or less transportation costs and overall household housing plus transportation costs?
And when does that, is that going to be
That-
another survey? Is that going to be a game for
No, it's
people?
not a survey. It's actually census data that's being mapped right now. It's really a research and analytical kind of process that will help to inform the Transopoly games, because we'll have maps at the Transopoly games that help people in the community understand what the relationship is between housing and transportation cost. There are, as I mentioned before, the survey data will be put together. And then there's going to be a longer term look at the economic development implications of different kinds of transportation related development. And that's really the domain of some other people, so I don't want to get too deeply into that. But we know that certain kinds.
So is that going to be within the city, or is that still staying within MTD?
Well, I keep saying MTD is sponsoring this, but MTD has created a mobility implementation plan committee, and that includes both of the cities. It includes the Regional Planning Commission. It includes the County of Champaign. It includes
Savoy.
the university. It includes the village of Savoy, so that this MTD-led process is really a collaborative process.
And is that how the work of the various consultants associated with those different entities is going to then get interwoven into what you all are doing and the information you're gathering for MTD?
The consultants for the different entities have already embarked on a collaborative relationship, and so I think that's certainly what we all hope and anticipate. Nobody's in a position to guarantee anything, but that's what everybody's driving toward.
And then what is going to be done with this information? I mean, is this going to be a 5-year long-term transportation master plan?
This effort right now is going to go on for a couple of years, but it's in support of the existing long-range transportation plan. It's more of an implementation plan. And to the extent that there are ideas generated that are actionable early, the Mass Transit District is interested in going ahead and implementing things that can be done quickly. For instance, there was an idea that was generated earlier about having a different kind of relationship to cars, and now the university has begun to look into that. And so wherever an idea can be grabbed and worked with, I think that everybody wants to go ahead and do that. Not say, well, the study doesn't end for another 2 years or 18 months, we'll wait and implement then. They want to go ahead and get started right now.
And what is the university's interest in cars?
Well, they're just looking at other ways to get people to think about using cars and everybody bringing their own individual car to the campus. I don't want to speak for the university because I'm not working for the university.
Okay, that's fine. The Center for Neighborhood Technology has an iGo car sharing.
We do. We do.
Plan.
I just didn't want to get specific about
okay.
one kind of plan over another.
Well, I'm well aware of that because
You are well versed.
Why don't you talk about that and talk about how it's working in the Chicago area, and car sharing is not just exclusive to the Midwest. It's alive and well in other parts of the United States.
And even more alive and well in Europe, where there are tens of thousands of people who belong to these car sharing companies, and people can travel to another city by train and then pick up their car sharing car, on vacation. Car sharing is one of those kinds of things that, when I was referring generically to, well, people may come up with an idea that we haven't even been thinking about before. 10 years ago, nobody in the United States that I know of was thinking about car sharing. But as people become aware of the cost of what it takes to own a car, and for many people, a car, or a second car in particular, is not used all that often. It may be that it's absolutely essential to get groceries once a week with that car, and people don't envision any other way of getting their groceries, or they may have to make 1 trip or 2 trips a week. But they have a sunk cost of several, well, it can be up to, $1,000 or $1,400 a month, depending on the make of the car and whether they have to pay for parking and everything else.
Insurance, right.
And insurance.
Mhm.
So the idea of car sharing is that if you don't have to commute by car every day, if you have choices in your life, if you have mobility options, you might choose to do something other than use your car and then transfer that sunk cost that you were spending on your car to education, buy a more expensive house if you want to do that, invest in eating out more instead of in buying gasoline, which is a real economic benefit to your community because every time you buy gasoline, it goes somewhere else that's not produced here. So if we can give people the opportunity to just act in their own economic interest, they can change. They can actually make the mindset change that people say Americans will never do. Oh, Americans will never get rid of their cars. Well, Americans do get rid of their cars when they're offered an option that gives them easy access, very inexpensive rates. The car sharing program we run in Chicago, people pay $6 an hour and 50 cents a mile. So I use it once in a while when I want to stock up on heavy groceries, and I pay a total of, $10.50 for an hour and a half and 3 miles. That's a lot better than paying several $100s a month for parking insurance and everything else that I would have to pay, even if I owned the car.
So you don't own a car in Chicago?
I don't own a car. Mm-mm.
And you do everything by mass transit or car sharing?
I'm multimodal. No, I probably walk and bike at least as much as I use transit, and I use a car as a last resort. And my household transportation costs are $75 a month for my transit pass.
So that's
it.
That's a very low percentage of your total
Very
month.
low.
monthly.
Very low.
I was at a conference in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and was on a tour for bicycle lanes there and bicycle pathways, which are very extensive. And the individual leading us does not own a car, and was talking about that he had a number of rental properties and does all the work on his rental properties via his bike and a carrier that he attaches to the back of his bicycle. And tongue-in-cheek, I facetiously said, well, we'll know we've arrived when Home Depot offers that as an alternative way of getting things back from Home Depot rather than renting the truck. And my facetiousness had to be swallowed because the Home Depot in Minneapolis is already offering that.
I always thought it was pretty good that they offered the truck rental, and they don't assume everybody owns a big vehicle.
So you are right. People are changing, and not only people, but the reason I tell that story is because it's very clear businesses are beginning to change and accommodate to these patterns of change within people who would not have purchased a carrier that could attach to the back of the bike. Home Depot is now providing that as an alternative for those who ride their bicycles there. How many people are now involved in the car sharing program?
We're having a party next week because we've hit our 3,000th member.
Wow.
We had 283 people join last month. So it's
exploding is
right.
what you're saying. And I don't remember the length of time it's been active up in Chicago.
It's probably been at least 4 years, but it was kind of slow going at first. There was a kind of mindset that had to be broken through. But then once we started getting enough critical mass in terms of membership, people started going, oh, I have a friend who does that, and they say it's really cool. And now we're moving very quickly.
So positive feedback and word of mouth is really expanding the program.
And, well, the other thing is having enough vehicles around. I think we have 70 vehicles now.
Wow.
So obviously people have to have easy access or it doesn't seem like a great idea.
Exactly. We know that in transportation research it is easy access connections and sometimes length of time, but it's easy
Right.
access is a key variable
Right.
there. And members of the Urbana City Council are working on bicycle sharing
Oh, good.
program, much like the Netherlands, where
Mm-hmm.
they will have a
Mm-hmm.
supply of bicycles that you'll just
See?
get on and ride to X and leave it there, and then somebody else might come along and then ride it from X to Y.
We
And
think there's a lot of creative ideas like that out there. They come from a lot of different places. So if we can find out exactly what people need in a better way, we can be much more creative.
well, and this you may not be acquainted with, though you might be up in the Chicago area, that the University of Chicago um, recently hired an individual who is specifically working on very creative ways to reduce the cars that are brought on campus by
Mm-hmm.
both staff, faculty, and students,
Mm-hmm.
because they are rather landlocked on that campus. But he's working on very creative ways of solving transportation, intermodal
Mm-hmm.
transportation. How can we do that, and how can we accommodate those times when you just have to bring the car on campus?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's sick,
Mm-hmm. Right.
many reasons, but you have not reserved a spot, and they're looking at it from a very economic saving standpoint. That means they're not having to build new parking garages or underground garages and things of that nature, and actually turning those monies back to people in the way of passes
Mm-hmm.
or gasoline or many creative ways. And is that something that the folks here in Champaign-Urbana should start integrating into some of the thinking and the university?
It's not my place to say what people should think about. My role is really just to say, here's the opportunity to express yourself. And I would just say to be creative and to think about the costs of things. It's really when you start to delve into what are the costs of things that people start to say to themselves, do I want to keep doing things this way? Or, gee, I didn't realize. You know, uh, there's a lot of redevelopment going on in the neighborhood that I live in,
And
and
you live where
well,
in
I
the
live in
Chicago?
Wicker Park, which
Okay.
is a
Mhm.
trendy neighborhood, and I walk to work because I'm very close to
Close
where
by,
I
you
live.
are indeed.
Um, but a lot of what used to be cheap parking is now expensive condos. I mean, as the price of land, as a
Mm-hmm.
community becomes successful and the price of land becomes more and more clear, people start to question the economics of leaving that land without generating taxes, without having a multi-story, and by multi-story I mean in my neighborhood, two to three story building on it. And so, rather than me say your community should do X, Y, and Z, I would rather say figure out what it costs to do the things that are being done now and ask, do we want to pay those costs? And if so, do we want to pay collectively as a society, or do we want the users to pay them? Or because there's a lot of what we do now is really very heavily subsidized, and the private behavior is subsidized by the public realm in terms of what's provided for transportation.
It is, and to build on your thoughts, some months ago, the state historic preservation officer was in the community giving a talk, and he had created a very informative chart um, showing the cost of having an SUV, a medium-sized car, and a small car, and relating that to sprawl.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time, it was when there was a referendum on where some new elementary schools would be built, and he just very simply charted it out against the points chosen for these elementary
Mm-hmm.
schools, or the supposed points, I should say, for the
Mm-hmm.
elementary school, and also the Catholic high school that's out beyond the freeway. And the cost of transportation alone, let alone time,
Mm-hmm. And
it was very helpful for people to see it on
mhm.
on a chart.
And that can't even begin to talk about the health costs of those kids not walking every day,
Yes.
which is another whole area. There is a Safe Routes to School bill that was passed in Illinois, and passed partly because we heard from the public 5 years ago when we did Transopoly the first time that their children's safety was really a critical issue. And it was an issue that they weren't hearing transportation planners really respond to. And there's a national Safe Routes to School movement going on, and we kind of got language for legislation from that, and now there is a bill here in Illinois that says there will be some money devoted to improving the areas around schools so that children can walk to school or bike.
Is it funded?
It's funded, but not enough.
Okay.
There's actually a national Safe Routes to School funding pot now. So the state didn't have to fund it themselves because the new transportation bill nationally put some money into that. It's not enough money, but there is at least a beginning acknowledgement that if kids are deprived of that little bit of exercise every day, it's going to have lifelong consequences for them in terms of childhood obesity, childhood diabetes, now becoming real public health issues.
This is a wonderful lead-in because the next conversation will be with Cynthia Hoyle and Spencer Landsman, and they are going to talk about safe route to schools.
Oh, good.
Because there is going to be a designated day in the community to focus on that. But are there any communities that we can look toward here in the state, since this bill has been passed, that have done some implementing and that we see some resultant changes because of the bill?
You know, this is maybe the perfect place to point out that transportation is a very long-term process. And when the federal bill generated some money for it last year, it takes a long time to get that money out on the streets. And for one thing, for good reason, there do need to be planning studies that go on. You don't just come along and say, well, I'd like to build this here, and gee, wouldn't that look nice, and maybe somebody would walk. There have to be safety studies done. There have to be environmental studies done. So, no, the answer is, the short answer is there isn't any example that I can point to in this state where people have already got something in the ground.
Okay. The state of California, though, is a very good.
The state of California.
They have done this.
Actually coined the Safe Routes to School term, and they created originally a fund of $25 million and said we're going to dole it out competitively. People write proposals, tell us what you want to do, and they were overwhelmed with demand for it. And I believe after they did it for the first year or two, they did increase the pot, but $25 million wasn't enough to even scratch,
not even
put a
in the
dent
state
in the
of
demand.
California. That isn't much. I'm holding up the brochure again to encourage people. Let me straighten this out a bit. To encourage people in the community when the meeting is in your area to definitely go play the game. It's lots of fun.
After they reserve, so they get a
Thank
dinner
you.
and materials. We can't have materials for everybody if we don't know who's coming.
Thank you very much. A very good reminder. And food, we all have learned that when food is offered, there's a direct correlation to participation. Would you please give the URL again so people
Sure.
know?
It's at the bottom now. I have, HAVE, my MI. I've had trouble remembering to spell it non-intuitively.
Right.
I have my plan.com.
So we have two resources. One is the web page when things start becoming active with the meetings. The
web page is up now.
Oh, the web page is up now.
The web page is up,
And-
and in fact, people can get much more detailed information about the locations of the meetings
Oh,
and
excellent.
what these squares actually mean. There are little definitions of this square is bounded by these 4 streets so that people will
Excellent.
be able to be more precise about where they want to go.
All right. Well, Jan Metzger, I thank you very much for joining me today in a conversation and talking about these forthcoming plans to improve our multimodal transportation in the community.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.